Good evening, afternoon, or morning. Movie Cat is at the microphone. I'll tell you a story about the girl who doesn't trust any man because of what her father did to her. For your attention, the second film in the MILLENIUM Trilogy, an action-packed detective thriller. The Girl Who Played with Fire. If you like what I do, please thumb up and write a couple of comments under the video and subscribe if you haven't already. Lisbeth Salander is sleeping and has a nightmare about how she was raped by her guardian, lawyer Niels Bierman, a year ago. Lisbeth wakes up, turns on the laptop and opens the search history in the browser of Bierman's computer. He has found a clinic in Marseille that can remove the tattoo Lisbeth gave him from his stomach. The girl understands that it's time to stop her year-long trip around the world and urgently return to Sweden. Lisbeth hires a notary to help her wisely manage the money stolen a year ago from the accounts of dishonest businessman Wennerstrom. The notary helps her buy a luxury apartment in the center of Stockholm and offers to invest the remaining money. The next day, in Stockholm, a blonde man of gigantic proportions approaches lawyer Bierman and says that his client is interested in the police investigation file on Lisbeth Salander 93. Bierman replies that he has the papers in his country house and one of these days he will be able to bring them, and then the blonde man brings Bierman home. Lisbeth, who is waiting for Bierman, notices the suspicious blonde and remembers his car number. Lisbeth waits for a while until Bierman falls asleep at home, and then she sneaks into his apartment. She finds the lawyer's gun in the table and goes to the bedroom to wake up Bierman. Lisbeth asks the guardian why he did not send a single positive report to the Guardianship Commission, as they agreed before. She promises to disappear from his life as soon as she is declared legally competent, otherwise she will send the video of her rape to all newspapers. She will do the same if something suddenly happens to her. And one more thing, Lisbeth says that if the guardian goes to get the tattoo removed at a clinic in Marseille, then she will tattoo it on Bierman's forehead. When Lisbeth leaves, an angry and frightened Bierman calls the blonde and promises to give up the investigation materials, but in return asks for a favor. The blonde must kill Lisbeth and bring the DVD that she keeps. Meanwhile, Mikael Blomkvist is planning the next issue of MILLENIUM magazine. Freelance journalist Doug Svensson spent 4 years collecting material about the trafficking of girls who are brought to Sweden from Eastern Europe to turn them into prostitutes. The journalist is working to expose the organizers of this black business, and to do this, he plans to talk to clients of prostitutes, among whom there are several police officers and even one prosecutor. Lisbeth calls her friend Miriam Wu to meet her at a bar and then invites her home to have some fun. Afterwards, Lisbeth offers Miriam to live in her old apartment for free, on the condition that Miriam gives her all the mail that comes here. Miriam Wu is surprised by such generosity, but she still agrees. Independent journalist Doug Svensson tries to meet with the first client of prostitutes, but he does not make contact. Later, Doug visits his girlfriend Mia, a crime reporter. She had been working with Doug for the last 4 years, but while he was looking for the owners of this prostitution business, Mia was interested in the victimized girls. Mia published her book on this topic today, and together with Doug they decide to celebrate. In the evening, Doug calls Mikael Blomkvist from home and says that a new name has appeared in the case, a gangster named Sola. Mikael wants to discuss this today and immediately goes to Doug. At the entrance, Mikael sees that the door to Doug's apartment is open. When he goes inside, he finds Doug and his girlfriend Mia killed. Horrified, Mikael calls the police, but all he can tell them is that the killer was here about 10 minutes ago. In the morning, prosecutor Ekström entrusts the investigation of the double murder to police officer Jan Bublansky and his team. At the same time, in the editorial office of MILLENIUM magazine, Mikael says that the journalists were not just killed, but executed, and the suspect may be on the list of clients of prostitutes that Doug was going to publish. The blonde man tries to find a police investigation into Lisbeth Salander at Bierman's country house, but to no avail. The police find out that the pistol found at the scene of the journalist's murder belongs to lawyer Niels Bierman, and the prints found on it belonged to a girl named Lisbeth Salander. The police also know that Lisbeth is not in good mental health. The court declared her incompetent and placed her under guardianship, and her guardian is lawyer Niels Bierman. The police try to arrest Lisbeth at the registered address, but she is not there. When the police come to Bierman, they find the lawyer murdered. An empty magnum box and reports about Lisbeth Salander to the Guardianship Commission are also found at his home. In the evening, Lisbeth walks around Stockholm and suddenly discovers an advertisement about her being wanted in connection with 3 murders. Lisbeth arrives at her new apartment and finds on the internet that the police consider her victims, Bierman and a couple of journalists, who were found by another famous journalist, Mikael Blomkvist. Then Lisbeth hacks into Mikael's computer, as she had done many times when they were looking for a serial killer together a year ago. On the hard drive, Lisbeth finds and reads all the materials collected by Doug Swenson. Mikael Blomkvist is sure that Lisbeth did not kill anyone and is trying to explain this to police officer Jan Goblansky, but without evidence he can't do anything. Then Mikael visits one of the clients of the prostitutes, a former state security officer, Björk, and asks him to tell more about the owners of the brothel, but he drives Mikael away. At the same time, Lisbeth chooses another client of the prostitutes, a journalist. She waits for him at his home, beats him with a stun gun, and ties him by the neck to a rope threaded through a hook in the ceiling. She says she wants to know who Sola is, or she will beat the journalist with a stun gun until his muscles fail, and he hangs himself. The journalist says that once bandits ordered him to deliver drugs from Tallinn, and when he refused, they brought him to some warehouse. There, in front of his eyes, a blonde giant broke some man's neck with his bare hands, and then a certain man, named Sola, called the journalist and asked if he wanted to leave. Meanwhile, Mikael finds a guy who once practiced boxing with Lisbeth. Mikael convinces him that he wants to help Lisbeth, but to do this he needs to find her, and for this he needs to contact her friend Miriam Wu, whom the boxer also knows personally. The boxer tries to call Miriam, and when she doesn't answer the phone, he goes to her house. Suddenly, at the entrance, he sees a huge blonde man grabs the girl, puts her into the car and drives away. The boxer follows and arrives at some warehouse outside the city, where the blonde man beats up Miriam Wu to find out how to find Lisbeth Salander. Then the boxer sneaks up and hits the blonde man from behind, and then again and again. However, the blonde man doesn't seem to care. He easily withstands several dozen hits, and then inflicts one of his own and knocks out the boxer. Realizing that he will get nothing here, Blonde closes the warehouse and sets it on fire. A minute later, the prisoners come to their senses, find a weak wall in the burning warehouse and get out. At night, Mikael receives a message from Lisbeth. She writes that she did not kill the journalists and asks her to help find out who Sola is. A minute later, the boxer calls Mikael and says he and Miriam Wu are in the hospital. Mikael arrives and the boxer tells him about a strange gigantic blonde man. The boxer hit him in the head several dozen times with all his might, but the blonde man did not seem to notice this. The next day, Mikael calls one of the prostitute's clients whom he had already met, Björk. Mikael knows that Björk worked with lawyer Bierman in the State Security Service in the 70th, and therefore assumes that Björk may know who Sola is. Björk sets a condition: Mikael must not reveal his name in the case of prostitutes, and then he tells who Sola is. His last name is Salashenko, but everyone calls him Sola. He was born in 1940. He was in good standing with the GRU, the military intelligence service of the Soviet Union. He knew 6 languages, mastered the art of camouflage and survival. Over the years, Salashenko began to think more about his own benefit rather than about the country. And one day he killed the military attaché in Madrid. Realizing that the bridges had been burned, he moved to Sweden and one morning came to the state security building and offered to share secrets in exchange for political asylum. The security guards agreed and, in exchange for valuable information, gave him a Swedish passport and some money. Björk concludes the story by clarifying that Sola could not have committed last week's triple murder because he is a disabled 69 years old. Lisbeth arrives at the country house of the late lawyer Bierman and, after a good search, finds a folder from the police investigation of 1993 in her case. Suddenly, she is met in the yard by 2 members of a biker gang, who were sent here by blonde men to burn down the house. The bikers underestimate Lisbeth and she stuns one, takes his gun, and then shoots the other in the leg. To find out more, Mikael goes to the hospice to meet Holger Palmgren, Lisbeth's first guardian. Palmgren has always been not indifferent to the fate of Lisbeth, and after making sure that Mikael also wants to help her, He says that he knows who Sala is. Alexander Salashenko is Lisbeth's father. He met Lisbeth's mother when she was 17. They conceived a child, and then Salashenko stopped coming home. But sometimes he still came and beat and raped Lisbeth's mother, and the guardianship service ignored all cases. This happened dozens of times, until one day in 1993, 13-year-old Lisbeth threw a plastic bag filled with gasoline into the father's car, and then a match. After this, Lisbeth was sent to a mental hospital. Her mother became seriously ill and could not recover, and Salashenko escaped any punishment. After a conversation with a former guardian, Mikael meets with policeman Bublansky, who is investigating 3 murders. Mikael tells him about who Salashenko is and why, when he was set on fire by Lisbeth in 1993, it was not the ordinary police who dealt with the case, but the Internal State Security Service. But Bublansky just shrugs it off and replies that he doesn't need the help of amateur detectives. At home, Lisbeth watches a press conference on TV where Bublansky talks about the recent abduction of Miriam Wu and shows a photo identikit of the kidnapper, a huge blonde man. Lisbeth has a photographic memory, so she easily remembers that she saw this blonde man when he gave lawyer Bierman home, as well as the license plate number of his car. Later, a psychiatrist, Dr. Taliborian, gives an interview. He says that people like Lisbeth should not be released from mental hospitals. Lisbeth remembers how Taliborian was the head of the mental hospital where she was admitted at the age of 13. Taliborian tied her to the bed for a long time and just watched it. In the middle of the night, Lisbeth comes to the hospital to show her friend Miriam Wu the identikit photo of the blonde man's and make sure that it was he who kidnapped and beat her. Lisbeth finds on the internet that the blonde man's car was rented. Then she goes to the company that owns the car. Lisbeth locks the seller in a closet and then finds a lease agreement. And there is a photo of the blonde's documents. His name is Ronald Niederman and he lives in Gothenburg. Lisbeth leaves 10,000 crowns on the table, frees the seller, takes one of his cars and promises to return it later. Having driven not far, Lisbeth stops to put stolen license plates on the stolen car, and then she goes to Gothenburg. In the morning, Miriam Wu calls Mikael Blomkvist and asks him to come to the hospital. Miriam is sure that Lisbeth will not be able to cope with the blonde man and asks Mikael to help her. Miriam gives the journalist the keys that Lisbeth dropped at night, and Mikael, after reading all her mail, finds a bill for an expensive apartment in the city center. There is a modern alarm system installed there, but when Lisbeth sees through the security camera that Mikael has arrived, she turns off the alarm. Meanwhile, the boxer comes to the Millennium editorial office and says that he has sent out a request with a description of blonde man to all the major boxing clubs in Sweden and neighboring countries. An answer came from Hamburg 17 years ago. A certain Ronald Niederman, a huge blonde, trained with them for a really short time. It is noteworthy that he had a very rare congenital disease, analgesia, thanks to which he does not feel pain at all. In Lisbeth's apartment, Mikael finds a police investigation from 1993, as well as a DVD where Bierman rapes her. Mikael is so horrified that when the editorial office calls him and tells him information about Ronald Niederman, he hears almost nothing. Later, Mikael arrives at the editorial office and hands over Lisbeth's file to Erika Berger, asking her to make several copies and give the original to policeman Jan Bublansky. Mikael then finds Ronald's address and heads there to help Lisbeth, as he believes he owes her a lot. Lisbeth finds the house where Ronald lives and watches him all evening, and at night, taking out a pistol taken from the bikers, she gets inside. Suddenly Ronald hits her from behind. When Lisbeth regains consciousness, a disfigured old man enters the room and says that the motion sensors in the courtyard warned of her visit several hours ago. Lisbeth immediately recognizes her father and mockingly asks if his face hurts, and where did he get such a freak of an assistant. Salashenko says that Ronald is her brother, that is, his son from a long-standing romance in Germany. Answering Lisbeth's questions, Salashenko easily admits that Ronald killed the journalists so that they would not reveal his business, built on kidnapping girls and forcing them into prostitution. They also killed lawyer Bierman because he had a folder with Lisbeth's case, and he also knew a lot about Salashenko's past. Suddenly the old man points a gun at Lisbeth and says it's time to go. Outside, Lisbeth sees a dark hole and, realizing what awaits her, she tries to escape. However, Salashenko takes aim, shoots and hits her in the head, and then Ronald puts Lisbeth in a hole and buries her. A few minutes later, the wounded Lisbeth digs herself out. At dawn, Salashenko hears strange sounds from the barn and goes to check. There, from an ambush, Lisbeth hits her father on the head with an axe, then plunges the axe into his knee. Ronald rushes to help his fathers, but Lisbeth prevents him from entering the barn by shooting at the doorway. Suddenly Ronald hears a car approaching the house and he decides to run away. Mikael gets out of the car and finds Lisbeth in a terrible condition. After some time, doctors arrive and one helicopter takes Lisbeth and the second, Salashenko, who also remained alive. Thank you for watching. If you are wondering why at the age of 13 Lisbeth was sent to a mental hospital, how long she was kept there and who is to blame for this, I am going to recap it in the third part of the Millennium series. To support the channel, thumb up, write a couple of comments and be sure to subscribe if you have not already.